My name's Alex Phillips. I'm Director at LMP China. We help companies from overseas, in particular from the UK, with their operations out in China, both in terms of selling to China and also sourcing from China. And today I'm going to talk about the 5 secrets of sourcing in China. To be honest, it's more areas of common sense to remind us all of when you approach suppliers in China or you're working with them, some best practice to lead you through that process. And it's common sense. I'll start off with a story of a company from the UK working with a supplier who called himself Mr. McGirl for this purpose. And a very experienced supply chain manager who's been supplying from China for a couple of decades found themselves at the hands of a fraudulent supplier. They received a package which was completely unrelated to their products from the supplier from China, and they were at a loss of what to do. They tried to get hold of Mr. McGirl. They couldn't get hold of him even though he was answering his phone before. We tried to help them seek out the address based upon the address that was on their business license. Again, couldn't be found, disappeared. And yeah, they were left without about £50,000 worth of goods and without a supplier in China. And it's mainly because they didn't really go through the due diligence of checking out the supplier beforehand that they ended up in this situation. So I wanted to start with this story to emphasize the importance of planning ahead, doing your due diligence on suppliers in China, so you don't end up in this situation and you end up in a successful relationship with your supplier and not at the hands of a fraudulent one. So we'll go through 5 different areas around sourcing in China, and we'll start off with just a basic question: is China still the place to get your products made? There's a lot of talk, or there has been a lot of talk over recent years about a lot of manufacturing moving to lower cost economies in Asia in particular. But this is just to emphasize that China really does have its advantages in its clusters of sourcing materials in China. You can see how much China makes up of global manufacturing. It's around 80% now, which has increased from just a few percentage points in the early 90s. And these percentages just emphasize those clusters. So 80% of air conditioners in the world, 70% of mobile phones, and 60% of shoes are all produced in China. And often they're produced in very close proximity to each other. And often whole towns are made up around just one product, factories and the supply chain around it over one product. And again, this place, Xintang in Guangdong, 1 in 3 jeans that are produced come from this one place. So again, when you're looking and thinking about your product, it's worth doing some research and figuring out what are the clusters around your product, because they're likely to be in very close proximity to each other, often in the same towns or cities or locations. And again, just to emphasize this point, furniture, something that's related to this exhibition, 70%, over 2/3 come from just one place. And there's a huge exhibition hall there, which this picture doesn't really do justice to. That similar to here, it's a place where most of those suppliers come to exhibit. So that's just a bit of background around why China. Is China still a good place to manufacture and go to work with suppliers? The answer is, I think, still yes. So how do you get started when looking to work with suppliers from China? This is best practice for any brand, any product when you go to work with suppliers. You need to have very clear product specs. I'm emphasizing this point with relation to China because there are certain challenges with language and time zone that really emphasizes the need even further, and you really need good, ideally English and Chinese versions. You need to have very, very clear images. You need to be very specific about any particular requirements that your product has, whether it's to do with the color, the quality, the materials. As often we found that you might communicate your requirements to a Chinese supplier, and it's important just to clarify that they really understand at a deep level what you're looking for, in particular where it's something quite special, quite unique. So yeah, state any special requirements clearly. If you can have an interpreter on your side when you go and visit, or with you over here, or a local point of contact just to clarify any specific or technical areas, that often helps. So that's what. When it comes to where, China's obviously a huge, huge country. It's the size of continental Europe or the USA, and so these clusters are dotted around and are quite far from each other. Generally, most of China's manufacturing, in particular with regards to these kind of products, and I see where a lot of brands in this area are from the south, and they're from Guangdong, or they're from certainly the eastern and southern seaboards of China. And this continues to be where most of China's manufacturing is based. There are some in central and western parts of China, and about 10 years ago, the Chinese government launched a policy called Go West, which encouraged manufacturers to relocate out there to develop those economies. So you can find lower cost manufacturers often out there. Labor cost is lower the more west or inland you go. However, if you're exporting from China via sea freight, so you need to take into consideration the overland costs of transportation to get it to the port. So that's really where the advantages of the southern and eastern seaboards. They're very close, and they're set up precisely for manufacturing and exporting industries. Like I said, the clusters you have around it, you'll also have whole industry, so you'll have export agents who work with the factories who are specialized in that particular product from that particular port, which all really, really helps to structure an efficient and good supply chain from China. So how do you get started? So we've covered your product specifications, about where your suppliers might be. So where do you go to find those individuals? So obviously, we're all here, so we all know that the trade fairs are an effective way. It's a way to communicate directly with suppliers. This kind of opportunity is fantastic, as these suppliers are coming over to the UK, or are very committed, or they already have a presence over here to do that. Out in China, you can find in any major city at the exhibition centers a packed calendar full of exhibitions in different product areas, different sectors, all year round. The main one is the Canton Fair, which happens twice a year. The next one is in October, usually once every spring, once every autumn. And again, it's a good way to go out, visit, speak to suppliers or agents directly. You can go online, so there are quite a few online trading platforms, the main one being Alibaba, which many of you probably would have heard of. There are others, such as DHgate is another one. It's a little bit harder to distinguish on these platforms who is an agent, i.e. a middleman, and who are the actual manufacturers and suppliers. So it's worth kind of asking more questions if you're communicating via one of these online platforms. When I did some work with one of these platforms in the past in China, we were constantly getting complaints from individuals from the UK or the US or Europe that they thought who they were speaking to was a manufacturer. In fact, they're a middleman, and therefore they couldn't get a lot of the requirements that they wanted. So you just need to be aware of who you're speaking to on these online platforms. Finally, you can choose an agent in China, so a sourcing agent. We'll go through that in a bit more detail very shortly about some of the some of the advice I would give you in terms of how to choose an agent and the different agents that are out there as well. But many of them will go out and source suppliers on your behalf, give you a short list based upon your product specifications, and even manage the end-to-end process of getting the products out of China to your home country as well. So once you've identified a supplier or a short list of suppliers, the next phase is how to check your Chinese supplier and go through due diligence. And there are 5 or 6 steps, I would say, that you need to go through out of best practice, just to verify that the supplier, the manufacturer you're working with is legitimate, they have a good track record, and you can be confident that they're going to deliver your product. Firstly, it's fine to check their business license. This is an example of one in China, which will have lots of information, not too dissimilar to if you check information on Companies House in the UK, but then with additional information as well. So it'll have the company name, the type of enterprise it is, its registered address, which is quite important because you can do a quick check on where that is, whether it's actually a manufacturing facility, their registered capital, who the legal owners of the business are, what the business scope of their business is. This is something quite specific to China. They'll have a list of the products that they're permitted to manufacture and supply and transact with in China. And if a product's not on there, then it might be a red flag as to whether they're the right fit for you or whether they're being compliant. And also the date of registration, which will give you an idea of how long they've been going for. So this, all very valuable information, all information that you can get through the equivalent of Chinese Companies House. Often you have to have an account to access it. It is all in Chinese, so you might need some local language support, but this information is publicly available. You can check some other licenses and information as well. This you usually have to ask for, not always publicly available. Things like their export license, just to make sure that it matches up with the information that they're providing from their core business license. And you want to check things that their name matches up, the signatures match up. If they don't, it might indicate that they're using an agent for export. If they are, then you want to know a bit more information about their relationship and how that affects delivery times and things like that. So useful to cross-reference. Run a credit check basically on them, and you can do this by asking for audited accounts. Just like here, companies will get audited every year, and reputable suppliers, I would say on the whole, would be happy to provide this, so don't be shy to ask, because they'll be quite used to reputable buyers from overseas asking for such information. So useful to check that the company's in good financial health. You can do a quick online check as well, both reviews that you might find through some of the trading sites, also reviews through some of the Chinese equivalents to Google, which is Baidu, or WeChat, which is a social media platform. And you might be able to find some local groups related to their product or industry that could give you some feedback, either negative or positive, that will help guide your decision. Another effective way to check out Chinese supplier, and something we often encourage, is to, once you've spoken to them, run almost a separate mystery call, if you like, and this is something that we often do with our clients, to call up anonymously, ideally in Chinese, and use some of the information that you found from the business license or elsewhere, and just clarify some of it. So ask them, I understand, your XYZ company. I understand that you're registered in this address in this province. Can I ask a bit more information about your products? And just to provide that secondary verification. Again, just making sure that it all adds up. And then visit. So this is something we encourage if you're working with suppliers directly, and especially if you're producing in significant volume and it's a crucial supplier relationship for your product and your business in China, go out and visit. Often supplier websites might have pictures that look quite similar to this. In reality, they might be a bit more like this. So it's worth going out and checking, just how the facility looks. And also it's a good chance for you to ask those important questions to do with your product, to do with the QC process. A very important question that we always encourage you ask, what are your peak time of years? They're going to be around Chinese New Year and the other national holidays in China, and how that affects how they manage the backlog of orders that they get at that time of year. Because around that, especially Chinese New Year, which is January, February every year, these factories, the suppliers will shut down for the best part of a month, and the most reputable suppliers will have good established processes to manage the backlog of orders that they will get before those peak times. So such questions are good to ask. And then, of course, you may have done this before you visit or after, or if you don't visit, go and get arrange samples to be produced before you start producing on volume. So resourcing in China, once you've identified a supplier, once you maybe started working with someone, there are various options to resource your sourcing operation. There's pictures of kitchen knives up here, because again, just a brief other story around a UK brand who was working with a supplier for kitchen knives from China, and due to a political campaign that was going on at the time, they were caught in customs because no knives were permitted to be imported or exported out, and they didn't have any local resource in China to sort this out with Chinese customs. The supplier didn't want to get involved, and so they had them stuck, basically incurring a charge at the warehouse at the port. So it just goes to emphasize that having the right resource, whether it's an agent, so your own people in China, or a reliable contact at your manufacturer, is really important for hopefully nothing this extreme, but something that does go wrong and sorting it out. So these are the 3 or 4 options you have available when sourcing from China. And we created this matrix which tries to distinguish between what's more appropriate at low order value or order volume and high, and also low and high involvement from your side at the bottom. And obviously, maybe the easiest way is to choose an agent or a sourcing trader in China. I distinguish those two between an agent being an established company with teams and offices out in China, which manages the whole process, and a trader's usually individuals who will work, or resellers who will work with you on more of a margin or commission basis, and they're individual traders more than agents. So that's the easiest way to probably to get started, least involvement from your side, and they will take care of everything from screening the suppliers to processing and managing the orders as well. The other way is to either purchase direct, so that way you cut out the middleman and you cut out a layer of costs as well. Does require you usually having to make regular visits out to China for QC, or to build up those supplier relations, or to firefight sometimes any problems. And also you'll need to lean quite heavily on your supplier's capability when it comes to export and the logistics side of things, in particular in China. The most involved option is to have an actual in-house China team. This is for companies of maybe a bit larger size who are doing much larger volume. You will be able to have kind of your complete QC in-house. You'll need an entity in China to support all of that, but it does give you the most amount of control. So we'll quickly run through each one. As I said, sourcing agents. The thing to mention here is how they charge for their services. you'll either get quoted a fixed fee, so maybe it's a fixed fee arrangement based upon the supplier that they find, sometimes just a finder's fee, or sometimes they'll work on a variable percentage basis, so based upon the margin of the order that they process or manage for you. Usually the fixed fee model works out cheaper in the long run. You have to consider whether your cash flow can absorb it, but if you can negotiate perhaps a higher fixed fee for them to source, manufacture, and manage the orders rather than an ongoing margin, then over the course of 12 months, 24 months, that will be preferable for you. And also confidentiality and IP protection. So whether you're working with a sourcing agent, a trader, or directly with your supplier or manufacturer, you need these strong clauses in your contract to protect you and give you some enforceability if they do run away and producing your product and selling elsewhere, or it pops up on eBay or the equivalent Chinese e-commerce websites. It does happen. It does happen, and I'm sure you've heard the stories. There's only so much you can do to protect yourself. It is also a bit of a marketing challenge to make sure that you're the brand that's attached to the product, because you have to be comfortable with a certain amount of risk that this does happen in China. I'd say on the whole, it's only the minority of suppliers who might play such games. I'm sure all of the people here wouldn't, and they're very reputable, but you just need to be aware. Traders, again, maybe suitable for smaller orders. Often they're middle men or women who will identify suppliers for you, often then hand over the process back to you. The thing to watch out for here is usually if they're just individuals, they might be loyal to just a certain group of factories. They might try to shoehorn you in to their preferred supplier. So make sure that whoever they're recommending does fit your requirements. As I said, purchasing directly, you cut out the middleman, but it can be a bit more stressful. Communication issues often are a challenge, or time zones as well. Very simply, by the time you respond to an email, it's already the next day there, and then so on and so on. I found that it almost doubles the time to get things done with suppliers or customers in China without having some points of local contact there to hurry things along when you're sleeping, basically. You'll need to consider regular travel out to China, at least in the early days. And just to say that whilst you can protect yourself if you're purchasing direct from the UK or wherever you are, you can be an easy target for those unreliable suppliers. So if you do end up entering into relationship with an unreliable, fraudulent supplier, obviously easier for them to disappear without a local point of contact there to chase them up. Sometimes orders naturally get deprioritized if you're not there yourself often, or you don't have a local point of contact. So again, most involved option, this in-house China team. You set up your own sourcing office. You generally made up of maybe a general manager who's very experienced in sourcing in China, a QC professional, and also logistics or export manager, though this can easily be outsourced to an agent whilst you're there. You see a lot more costs involved, but you do get complete control. There's two options to set up an entity. You can either have a representative office, which gives you the authority to employ staff, or a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, which you can also transact commercially in China if you end up going to sell in China as well. And this is one of my final slides, and it's to do with selling in China, because we have found, I started off this talk around obviously the growth of China as a manufacturing nation, as an export-driven economy, and it still very much is, but China is a huge consumer market now. these statistics, so the percentage of urban population that are now classed as middle class, it's going to be over 75% by 2020. It was just a few percent in 2000. 700 million internet users. They'll have the average purchasing power equal to USA. So China is becoming a developed country and a rich country in itself. And so if you ever have visions of selling to China, you need to structure things properly when you are supplying from China as well. And this usually means having a reliable agent or an entity out in China, because the last thing you want to happen is for your supplier to start selling directly on your behalf in China. And again, it has happened, so you just need to put protections in place for yourself, put the right structures in place. So if you go on to sell in China as a sales market, that you don't get caught out. This is a slide which the organizers told me to include. If there's one thing to remember, if it sounds too good, then it probably is, to be honest. And I would just continue to ask questions and get to the bottom of the deal that they're proposing. Don't always just accept yes as the answer. Go out there, check it for yourself, get the samples, have an agent do it for you. But yeah, that's probably one piece of advice to go away with. And that's it. So we have lots of guides and other information on our website that you can download, or feel free to ask any questions after this. Happy to talk with you or follow up with an email. Happy to take a conversation forward as well. Thank you.